begin there. Talk to us for a moment about patriotic philanthropy.
All philanthropy is patriotic in some sense. Philanthropy is a derivative of an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. And so I like to remind people that you can be philanthropic by giving your time, your energy, your ideas. The most valuable thing you can give is your time. You can always get more money if you're disposed to do so. You can't get more time. And so I try to remind people that these lists of great philanthropists that we list often list how much money they give away, but they don't actually list people who give great ideas or time and so forth. That's unfortunate. Philanthropy is something that the United States is very much the leader in the world in. We give a larger percentage of our GDP to philanthropic causes than any other country, and there's a lot of historic reasons for that. By patriotic philanthropy, I didn't mean to say that other philanthropy is not patriotic, but I was trying to coin a phrase that basically described what I was trying to do, which is to remind people the history and heritage of our country. So with the documents or fixing monuments, memorials, I was trying to remind people the history and heritage, and why is that? What's the relevance of it? This is it. Our human brain has not yet evolved so much that if you go to a computer slide and you see the Magna Carta, it will have the same effect as if you go and actually see the Magna Carta. Because when you see on a computer slide, you'll probably go to the next computer slide or just be, a quick flip in your brain. But if you actually take the time to go visit the Magna Carta or some other similar historic artifact, you're going to probably spend time reading about it before you go, or when you're there, or afterwards. And so therefore it has more of an impact. Now why do I care whether people learn more about the Magna Carta or other historic documents or the Washington Monument? This is the main reason, this is the whole purpose of it. The theory of history is that you study what went on in the past so that you can correct the mistakes you made in the past and improve on the good things, and basically civilization will advance. Sadly, right now, we've been obsessed with STEM and other things, and the result is we don't teach history very much. Only 2% of males going to college today major history. Only 1% of females major history. History majors are down dramatically in every major college. You can graduate from any college in the United States today without having taken their history course. So why is this important? Well, the results are in certain surveys. You see this. 3/4 of Americans today, 75%, have not named the 3 branches of government. 1/3 of Americans have not even named 1 branch of government. 10% of American college graduates think that Judge Judy is on the United States Supreme Court. Not yet the case. And 16% of Americans in another survey said that Justice Scalia is the Chief Justice of the United States. He's not even alive anymore. And one last fact before I end my soliloquy on this point. If you are a naturalized citizen, are there any naturalized citizens in this room? Okay. To be a naturalized citizen, it used to be you had to take 14 years of residence. Now it's 5 years. After 5 years of residence, you have to study for a citizenship test. Ultimately, you take 10 questions and you have to pass 6 of them. Those people who take it, 91% pass. Presumably there's some study. Questions are not that difficult. Who's the first president of the United States? How many branches of government are there? Things like that. The same survey was recently given to 41,000 native-born Americans. And you can predict where this is going. In 49 out of 50 states, a majority of people who are born in this country couldn't pass the basic citizenship test that foreign applicants to our country have to pass. Only one state, Vermont, with a majority of citizens and barely passed it.
Your book, The American Story, Conversations with the Master Historians, comprises a series of quite remarkable interviews that you conducted at the Library of Congress with scholars, historians, journalists, before members of Congress in a neutral and non-partisan setting. Talk about the genesis of this project.
The theory of history, as I said, is that you want to know the past so you can improve upon it or avoid the mistakes. Who better to know the past than the people making the laws? So my theory was, why not spend some time educating members of Congress, not that they're not perfectly educated already, but maybe they can learn a little bit more about history. And so what I would do is I would host a dinner with the Library of Congress once a month at the Library of Congress, where members can come. They can come to underground tunnels, so it's very easy. They can come to their office buildings. And we get 250 to 350 people coming each time. About half of them are members, half of them are guests. And the members have great interest in it. I asked them to sit with people from the opposite party, in the opposite house, which they rarely can do in a public setting anymore. And they have a kind of a section before where they talk about whatever they want to talk about, but then they see the historic documents relating to the book that the author will talk about. Then we go down, we have a dinner, and after dinner I will do a 45-minute interview, and then the members can ask questions. Other questions often tend to be statements, not questions. But and then they're like other people. They bring their dog-eared copies of their books, just like anybody else. They want to autograph. And so what I did is take about 16 of those interviews. I've now done about 50 of them, and I put them into this one book, and I summarized it a bit in advance, and then I kind of gave the edited transcript in a way that I think people can read each interview on its own and learn a lot about history without having to read a detailed book. Now, let me just say, if you are disposed to do so, reading a detailed book or a textbook will probably learn more. But I don't know how many people will read a 900-page textbook. And so the theory that not that many people will do it, if people read this book, they'll learn a little bit more about history than they did without the tribulation of having to go through a 900-page textbook.
There are the interviews, and then there are your introductions to the interviews, which are so interesting and intriguing. How about your process for writing those introductions?
Well, I did the interviews, and then when I decided to do the book, I would go back and reread the interview and just think about what I could say that would encapsulate what the person said. You want to say enough so that people have a kind of a appetizer of what the interview is going to be. You don't want to say what's in the entire interview because you might not be the interview. And you always want to have a little fact or kernel that might be interesting and might be a tease of it to read the entire interview.
The late Washington Post publisher Phil Graham famously coined the phrase, "Journalism is the first rough draft of history." In fact, in 1776, many Americans first saw the Declaration of Independence in a newspaper. What's your impression of the value of newspapers in both writing the first draft of history and preserving it for future generations?
But not online. I go buy them, and I've already read my newspapers today. I like reading them. I like turning pages. I like doing that. But obviously, many people who are younger than me feel that newspapers are a bit dinosaurs. I can't get my 3 children, all of them are extremely well educated, to really read physical newspapers. They read something online, and they're like their generation. Newspapers, though, give you more or less instant report on what happened that day or the previous day. And I think they often have very good analyses from time to time. But because we have demonized journalism to some extent, we find increasingly that people think that everything is biased, and therefore people are afraid of reading anything, and they just therefore diminish the importance of newspapers relative to what they were when I was growing up.
In the course of your interviews, did you find that there were differences in the way the journalists you talked with approached their subjects versus the historians and those you consider scholars?
Sure, a journalist like Bob Woodward is different than, he writes a book, he's writing a different type of book than Doris Kearns Goodwin or David McCullough. Some of the scholars who write these books, like Doris Kearns Goodwin, spend 10 years researching and writing. So you really have to be dedicated to that process. A journalist like Bob Woodward, as good as he is, he will probably spend about 1.5 years doing the research, and then he writes the book. And maybe the whole process takes years, not to diminish it, but it's different than the kind of sitting in the library kind of thing that some of these scholars do, where they're just poring over old letters or manuscripts for years at a time. They're both very valuable services, and I think Bob Woodward's books have had a record. I think he has had more #1 bestsellers in the nonfiction category than anybody in our history. I think he's written like 20-some books, and I think about 19 or so were #1 bestsellers. It's an extraordinary record. But I think his book is a different type of read than Doris Kearns Goodwin's book or David Blight's book. I just interviewed at the Library of Congress a couple of days ago. David Blight on his book on Frederick Douglass, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019. He's a Yale professor. It's an incredibly scholarly work, but it takes a while to get through it. It's like 800 pages. And sometimes I think historians now are getting paid by the word because they are longer and longer. Charles Dickens used to get paid by the word. And sometimes these books they're exhausting. I interviewed, and it's a great book, and I'll interview again, Jill before, on her book on American history, These Truths. But these books are often 900 pages, and it takes a while to get through them. I don't know if everybody has the patience anymore to go through these books. But it they do?
Your interview with Walter Isaacson was quite intriguing. Most reporters subscribe to shoe leather journalism. They like to actually interview people. Talk about what you learned about the difference between writing about someone who's still alive and someone who's dead.
For those who don't know, Walter Isaacson is himself a Renaissance man in my view. From New Orleans, went to Harvard, Rhodes Scholar, ultimately became the top editor of Time magazine, the president for a while of CNN for more than a dozen years around the Aspen Institute. He's now teaching at Tulane. But while he did all those things, he wrote biographies on Steve Jobs, Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, and on the Wiseman he did with Evan Thomas. And he's kind of a person who can be a journalist, because he was a journalist, but he also can write fairly scholarly works. And think about it. To write a book, and he did a book on Leonardo da Vinci as well. To do a book on Albert Einstein, you have to go back and actually learn German, and you have to know physics and understand the theories of relativity, which he did. It's quite impressive that he could do that. Walter writes books that are, I'd say, popular books, pretty scholarly, but they're not as scholarly as, let's say, the most scholarly person at Harvard or Yale or Berkeley or Stanford might be, but they're readable. And if you write a great book, there is a scholar woman who writes incredibly scholarly books on a very famous president, but nobody reads them because they're too dense, they're too long. So you need to have people read your books. And so one of the things that Walter Isaacson has been able to do is to figure out how to write in a journalistic way, fairly scholarly, but also make great access to things. For example, his book on Steve Jobs, I think it sold, 12 million copies or something. It's extraordinary. People were so interested in Steve Jobs. It's not a scholarly book in the traditional sense, but it's a book that people learned a lot about what Steve Jobs in the industry was about, computer industry. So I think it's a great public service.
When you look at some of the best obituaries in the New York Times and the Washington Post and a few other publications, which are sometimes written as what are called appreciations, they're really very dynamic and wonderful feature stories. It's just that the subject isn't available to you for the interview. And Walter talked about in your time with him the difference between writing about Ben Franklin and, for instance, Steve Jobs. You asked him what was the impetus for the Steve Jobs book, and he said Steve Jobs called me and told me to write a book about it.
Well, there are three types of people, books you can write about books people have been long dead, Benjamin Franklin. And the advantage of that is they can't come back from the grave and say you're wrong. Then you can write about people who are probably not going to live too long and won't see the book, which is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs knew that he was dying. He asked Walter Isaacson to write a book about it. He earlier asked to do stuff, and Walter said, well, I have to write that people are dead. So ultimately, he had access to the family, and the book came out just about 2 or 3 weeks after Steve Jobs died. There, too, you have a situation where you have access to the person, you can talk to him or her, but they are not going to be around to rebut what you wrote. And then third, you have people who are still alive. When one of the books that I did mention earlier that Walter Isaacson wrote was about Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger did like the book, and I think they did talk for a while because Kissinger did like what was said about him. So there's an advantage of writing about a book about somebody who's long dead, there's no relatives around who would be upset with what you said. On the other hand, you don't have the immediacy of it. I often ask authors, when they're writing about somebody who's dead for 100 years, if you had dinner with this person, what would you like to ask them? And many people say, well, I'd love to ask these questions or that question. But actually, in many cases, they say, well, I think I know everything about the person. I don't have an obsession with having dinner with this person because I spend so much time living with the person, I feel I know what he or she would say.
Marvin Calvin's brother Bernard wrote a biography together of Henry Kissinger, and as the story goes, somebody asked Kissinger what he thought of the book, and he said, I don't know about the book. It was called Kissinger. And he said, I don't know about the book, but I love the title.
Well, Kissinger has a lot of more books written about him, and usually when they're written, he doesn't like what was written initially, but then later he comes around to it. And he's a unique figure in American history for sure.
Based on your interviews, did you get a sense that people make their times, or that times make the people?
The great debate of historians have had for several thousand years is it great men or great women that actually make something happen, or the events that are coming along, and so great men or great women kind of ride the wave. Nobody really knows the answer. I think there's probably something in between, but clearly if certain people hadn't existed, certain events probably wouldn't have happened. So there are great people who can make things happen, but if Martin Luther King had not lived, I suspect at some point there would have been a civil rights revolution. He might not have been the progenitor of it, or one of the progenitors of it, but there would have been others. I suspect if Abraham Lincoln hadn't come along, eventually we would have ended slavery, maybe not quite the way he did it. But so I think, people can make big changes and they can make events happen. If Hitler hadn't come along, I suspect Germany would never have done what it did, but Germany might have still gone into a world war, might have been different than what would happen. We wouldn't have the Holocaust almost certainly. So I think great men and great women, or terrible men and terrible women, can make a difference, but I think sometimes events will eventually produce a certain effect that would be similar to what a great man or woman would have done.
Through these interviews that you've conducted, have you felt that you can actually touch the people of history through their biographers?
It is interesting how you can read a biography of somebody that's dead for 100 years or 200 years, and when it's so much detail, you feel like you know these people. And so if you read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about Abraham Lincoln, Team of Rivals, you feel like you know Lincoln and his cabinet rivals. And so these are great gifts to knowledge that these books can be written. So yes, I think you do.
There's one very different interview in the book, and it is with Chief Justice John Roberts.
Right.
Talk about your motivation for interviewing the Chief Justice. I understand that the turnout among members of Congress was the largest of any of the interviews you conducted.
Right. John Roberts, I've been, for a number of years, I've been the chairman of the Smithsonian, and the Chief Justice is the Chancellor of the Smithsonian, so you get to spend some time with him. Quarterly we have lunch and so forth. So I've gotten to know him over the years, and he's a very, very smart guy. Harvard College, summa cum laude in 3 years, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude, Supreme Court clerk. Actually, he points out, and I think that we have it in the book, in the interview, that as a young man, he was invited to work at the White House as an associate deputy counsel for Ronald Reagan. So the first day he gets there, he gets a call from a friend of his who works at the White House saying, the president is going to call you shortly this morning to welcome you. The president likes to welcome, President Reagan likes to welcome everybody who comes to the White House. So you'll get one today. John Roberts, who's a young kid, didn't think he was going to see the president, agree with the president, all happy. So sure enough, 10 minutes later, a call comes in, please hold for the president. All right, so John Roberts is sitting there holding for the president, and 5 minutes later, the president's on one. 10 minutes later, the president's on one. Then you figure 15 minutes later, the president's on one. Maybe Gorbachev was off, maybe there's a war going on, you don't know. 30 minutes later, 45 minutes later, about 45 minutes into holding for the president, they hear laughter in the hallway. There was a bet on how long this smart guy would take before he realized the president's not calling you for a second. And just John Roberts at the beginning, I said, Mr. Chief Justice, the reason I wanted to put John Roberts in there is that the Supreme Court is only a couple hundred yards from the Capitol. And actually, the Supreme Court used to be in the Capitol building, though the Supreme Court building opened around 1935 or so. I wanted members of Congress to understand better how the court works, because although their offices are not that far apart, they don't really have much interaction. So when I began the interview, I said, Mr. Chief Justice, did you always want to be, as a little boy, Chief Justice of the United States? And he said, well, no, I didn't. As a little boy, I didn't. But did you want to be an Associate Justice and not the Chief Justice? No. But did you want to be a judge of any type? No. Did you want to be a lawyer? No, I didn't want that either. Well, what did you want to be? I wanted to be a historian. All I cared about was American history. My father said, John, there's no money in being a historian. You won't be able to make a living, you won't be able to support your family, and nobody will read the books you write. John said, I don't care, this is what I care about. So he went off to Harvard and majored in history. He came back from spring break, gets off at the airport in Boston, Logan Airport, and gets in a cab and says to the cab driver, please take me to Cambridge. The cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? Majoring in history. Well, the cab driver said, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So, I was in the law school.
Wonderful story. Let's talk about truth. Is there a difference between revisionist history and filling in the blanks along the way as we learn more information about people and events?
Of course, we look at things differently than we did maybe 100 years ago, so there's always some revisionist history. So for example, when all of us were in school, or most of us are, if you're roughly my age, we looked up to George Washington, first President of the United States, presided over the Constitutional Convention, won the Revolutionary War, an extraordinary person. It wasn't emphasized to me when I was in the 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade that he was a gigantic slave owner. He owned roughly 300 slaves, upon his death, he and his wife had roughly 300 slaves. When I was growing up, Thomas Jefferson was the writer of the Declaration of Independence, an extraordinary document that he, was a little bit of plagiarism. Plagiarism was thought to be okay in those days, so it wasn't a terrible thing. But it wasn't emphasized to people in my day, when I was a kid, that he had a relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings, for 30 years. And was it consensual, was it forced? You never know. We will probably never know the answer to that. But now people, look at him differently because of this relationship. And he was a slave owner as well, and he had roughly 200 slaves at Monticello. So yes, there has been revisionism. These people who we once idolized in certain ways, we realized they were humans with flaws. In this particular case, as for I think 9 of the first 12 presidents were slave owners. So we look at things much differently than we did years ago. I think some of that is correct. On the other hand, sometimes you can go back and have modern views, and maybe it's unfair to criticize people for things that they did 200 or 300 or 400 years ago, which were acceptable then and not now. But there's no doubt revisionism. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good.
For our viewers and listeners, we're speaking with David Rubenstein about his book, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians. Going back to that quote from the man who shot Liberty Valance, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. You actually have a story about taking your then 8-year-old son to Mount Vernon, which helped propel him.
So what it was this. We've all heard the story that George Washington cut down a cherry tree when he was a little boy. His father asked him if he cut it down. He said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did." Now that story was completely wrong. It never happened. It was made up by an early biographer of George Washington, and there is nobody who's a serious historian would say that story is true. But okay. But people still believe it. I believed it when I was little, and my son probably believed it. So when I went to Mount Vernon, I took my 8-year-old son. We were in the back area of Mount Vernon, and there was a big a tree, kind of twig or maybe a branch that had fallen off. And my son said, "Dad, is that the cherry tree that George Washington cut?" And I said, "I cannot tell a lie. It is." So, maybe but he believed it, and it's like Santa Claus. I mean, is it bad to tell people that there's no Santa Claus maybe at 3 or 4 years old? I don't know. But maybe they'll figure it out eventually. So I didn't want to disturb his view about George Washington, so I told him a little lie.
And the legend becomes fact. Print the legend. I'm going to ask our wonderful audience here at the National Press Club to prepare for asking your questions, and I'm going to come to you in just a moment. Lindsay Underwood of our team at the Press Club has a microphone which she will bring to you. I'm going to ask David one more question, make history, and I will suggest the election of Barack Obama as president, for instance, perhaps for those of us that are baseball fans, even the Washington Nationals winning the World Series. How do we ensure that these don't become fleeting moments in a world that consumes information quickly and disposes of it like fast food?
Well, with the information overload that people have today, it's very easy to kind of just, watch some Twitter feeds and think you understand what's going on. Most young people today seem to be getting their news from Facebook Live or some Facebook presentation or from Twitter or so forth. It is amazing how many people think that this is all they need to know. But newspaper sales are way down, as you know. Newspapers aren't selling the way they used to and so forth. I think that one of the best things I encourage people to do in this regard is to read books. Now, reading is a sad situation in our country. We are the wealthiest country in the world, in many ways the most educated in the world, but roughly 14% of our population, our adult population, is functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the fourth grade level. And I don't mean somebody that came from Latin America and can read Spanish but can't read English. I mean somebody that came from Latin America can't read Spanish either. 14% of our adults are functionally illiterate. And if you are functionally illiterate, you have no chance, in my view, of escaping from the bottom of our economic system. 2/3 of the people in our federal prison system are functionally illiterate. 80% of the people in our juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate. And so, and there's another problem of literacy, where people don't read books when they can. 30% of college graduates never read another book after they graduate from college. 50% of Americans have not bought a book or been in a bookstore in the last 5 years. 50% of Americans have not bought a book or been in a bookstore in the last 5 years. So I tell younger people that the best thing to do is exercise your brain. And when I give a commencement speech, I say, great, you got your degree, but you're not an educated person. You're beginning the process of being educated, and you want to keep your muscle, which is your brain, alive. You've got to keep reading. And you can read lots of different things, but nothing exercises the brain so much as reading a book. Now, other things exercise the brain, but in terms of reading a book, because you have to concentrate for a while. It's not like reading a newspaper article where you can read it in 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and go to the next thing. If you read books, you tend to really focus things more. And I think people that read books generally tend to have better thought processes. They can think better, and I think it makes them more educated. And in Washington, D.C., we have the National Book Festival, which is on around Labor Day usually. About 200,000 people come. It's incredible to see 150 of the best authors in the United States coming, reading from their books, signing their books, being interviewed about it, and it's free, and I love people to go to that. I've been involved in it for a while, and to me, books are very important. When I was very young, my parents couldn't afford to buy a lot of books, so I would go to the library and I would take out as many books as I could, take out 12 at the age of 6, and I would read them all in one day, and I had to wait another week before I could take them out, another 12. But I love reading books, and to me, it's something that more and more people should consider doing as part of their life, is reading books.
Thank you. Not only perhaps is reading books a challenge today, but sometimes when we ask questions of our audience,